Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar of the outcome harvesting community. My name is Julis Geers, and I'm an independent consultant based in Belgium, and I've been working with outcome harvesting since its very beginning. I'm also one of the outcome harvesting community facilitators, together with Connie Hoiting and Carmen Wilson Grau. Carmen, can you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, welcome. As Cole mentioned, my name is Carmen Wilson Grau. I'm a second generator evaluator specialized in outcome harvesting, and I'm based in Guatemala.
Hey, Connie?
Hi, my name is Connie Hoiting. I'll change my name. I'm an independent consultant as well, based in the Netherlands, working on outcome harvesting.
Great, thanks. If you haven't done so yet, please do join our community. You can do so on the outcomeharvesting.net website. During this webinar, please keep yourself muted. During the presentations, the webinar is also being recorded, and the recording and the slides will be shared with you in the community and on our website after the webinar. If you have questions, you're free to put them into the chat box already during the presentations, but we will come back to them after the last presentation. This is actually the 20th webinar of the outcome harvesting community. We have seen many interesting presentations on outcome harvesting, and for sure there are many more interesting outcome harvesting stories to be told. So if you're interested in presenting your experience about outcome harvesting in a webinar, then please do write to us. So today's webinar is about AI-driven innovations for outcome harvesting. There is a rapid expansion of AI in general, but definitely also in the evaluation field. So there's some keen discussions going on this topic. We actually had a first webinar on AI and outcome harvesting in February, where Leon Hemkemeyer and myself explored the use of AI for outcome harvesting and presented 3 custom-made AI bots that can be used for outcome harvesting. And we also presented this at the European Evaluation Society conference in Italy a few weeks ago. We did this together in a panel with today's presenters, and we thought it would also be interesting for those of you who were not able to come to EES to also listen to these presentations. So I'm excited to have with us here today Connie Rasman, who will talk about how Qualia, which is an AI-powered interview platform, can be used to automate outcome harvesting interviews. And of course, if you talk about AI, it's also good to keep in mind some principles. And Heather Britt, who is just like Connie, a first-generation outcome harvesting practitioner and independent consultant, will explain how using principles can guide decisions about how and when to apply AI to support outcome harvesting analysis. And finally, we have Steve Powell from Causal Maps with us, and Steve will show how Causal Maps built with AI can support the visualization of structured outcome data. So, without further ado, I hand over to Connie, who's going to take us through the first presentation on Qualia. Over to you, Connie.
Yeah, thanks very much, Hule. Let me start my presentation. There you go. Here we go. So thanks very much again for the nice introduction. I hope you can see the screen properly. Yeah, thanks. I just need to get you back. I need to see the timekeeper. Yeah. Okay, so some of you may actually have seen the webinar that Hule mentioned before in February, where Hule and Leon talked about artificial intelligence-based tools for outcome harvesting. And as Hule said in this webinar, artificial intelligence can actually support really each step of outcome harvesting. And together with my co-authors today on this presentation, that's also Steve, who will be talking later, and Gabi, who's here in the audience, we looked especially at the harvesting step. This means how can artificial intelligence really help us to automate interviews in outcome harvesting? Now, why would we do this? Outcome harvesting, as many of you know, probably really thrives on interviews. First, we have to harvest an outcome. That means we often interview really many people, several people. First, the change agents to get an inkling on where outcomes may be. And then we go to the societal actors, we call them, those who change, and ask them as well on their views on the outcome. And then we go back to the change agent. So this is what we call ping pong or the outcome journey. And this back and forth of conversations to identify an outcome and then to refine it, that takes a whole number of interviews. And then secondly, the interviews themselves take really a lot of time in outcome harvesting very often. We have to get our interview partners into the spirit of thinking of outcomes as behavioral changes, as we do in outcome harvesting. We need them to really think of behavior, and that takes some time because they normally think of outcomes as indicators, or sometimes at least. And then once we identified a behavioral change, we need to get into this nitty-gritty detail to make the outcomes smart, meaning really specific and really plausible. So imagine a world where a bot actually takes this workload off our shoulders. Wouldn't that be nice? So why would we do automation? Or rather, let's call it artificial intelligence interviewing. Automation is something else. How can it help us? Well, we thought initially it can save time and costs. But also, it's not only a time saver, and that's the more important point. If we can interview many more people, we can also be more inclusive. When we increase our sample, we reach more people, we can hear more voices on the ground, perhaps, and that brings out the power of outcome harvesting in that it can capture also unanticipated outcomes that we only hear when we listen to a good number of voices on the ground. Now, why don't we do just a survey? Surveys have been around for a long time. As you know, I've been using surveys actually for outcome harvesting frequently. And yes, they are a good tool, but they follow a rigid structure, a rigid script. And what we need as an outcome harvester, we need to really adapt to the responses of our interview partners. We need to first, meander around until we have discovered an outcome, then identify that it's a behavioral change, and then dig deeper, really to unearth, as I said, the nitty-gritty details. And that's what the bot really needs to do. And that's what a bot can do better than a survey, of course. So it needs to be just like a human harvester. So let me introduce you to the bot. As Kule said, it's called Qualia. And Qualia formerly used to be named Story Survey. It's been developed by the Causal Map team, that's Steve, who will be talking later, together with Fiona Remnant and Gabriela Caldas Cabral. And it's a web-based platform that uses GPT-4o as a language model, at least the one we were using now. There's actually an updated, even better version that Steve may be talking about later that can do all sorts of nice other things. But we think the GPT-4o model is still rather good, very good actually, for these complex in-depth interviews that this bot needs to do. And what's also very nice is that the interviews can be done in various languages. It depends on your browser that you're using. So we had a pilot study in Austria, so it was in German, and we could set up the interview bot in English using English prompts, but the interviews themselves would then be done in the language of the people in German. And the other nice thing is that the respondents don't need any official accounts, commercial accounts for example, ChatGPT or Qualia. They can just use the bot. So what does Qualia do? We adopted Qualia really for outcome harvesting, and I will show you this later, but how does it actually work? So we get a link that we can send to our respondents, and that can also be individualized. That means you can track from whom you receive an interview. That avoids that you get multiple interviews from the same person, for example, and you also know who has already responded. Then this link opens a browser window, just like this animation that you see here. Qualia asks the question, and then you can type in, or nowadays even push a button and then talk, and your answer will be captured. You can do this wherever and whenever you want, and you can come back to Qualia as long as you're using still the same browser. Then Qualia will inform you when the interview is actually done, when it's completed, and then you can download it right away as a doc, as a Word file, so to say, as a text file, or even as CSV for Excel, and then analyze it with whatever means you want to use. Now, let me give you a sense of what's actually going on behind the scenes, how we instructed the prompt. The time is too short to really do an interview here. But I would like to share with you how we set up the prompt, how we structured it. So there are several modules. The first module, A, was information actually on the bot itself, so to say, to instruct it with the same information that we would have as human harvesters. So first there are instructions on how the bot should behave, friendly but still insistent, for example. Then we provided some background on the project. And thirdly, and that was really important, we provided information on the type of stakeholders that the bot could encounter. For example, there are stakeholders that are internal, and you will ask them different questions than external stakeholders that know less about the project, of course. Then the second module was about the actual outcome harvesting. We started the outcome harvesting guidelines, so to say, with the bot asks about the name of the person and the context. So this is needed to really identify whether it's an internal or an external stakeholder. This is where it took the information. And secondly, the bot would ask then to identify a key game changer. So note that we're not right away asking about a behavior change, but we kind of set the scene, we prepare the scene so that the respondent can talk about changes in their own way first. But once a change is identified, then the actual outcome harvesting starts, and we walk through an outcome harvesting guideline, so to say, asking about the outcome description, who changed, how, when, where, then the significance and the contribution. I'm not going into this. We can all read this up, how outcome harvesting is being done. After the actual outcome harvesting, after all information about an outcome has been collected, then the bot asks if there are any further outcomes related or unrelated to the outcome that was just described. And if there are, this part is being repeated as often as the respondent wants to provide new information. And then we get, if there is no further outcome, we get to the step C, so to say. The bot, and that's really nice, does a summary of the outcome right away and runs it past the respondent. So we have a confirmation that we captured the outcome correctly right after the interview. It also asks about confidentiality. Is there any information that we shouldn't share? And whether we as research persons can come back to the source and ask further questions. And then finally, there was one part that we only use for this pilot study, namely, what did you think about the interview? Was it agreeable? Do you have any suggestions? So we come to the actual pilot. It was a very tiny pilot. We piloted Qualia in a project I'm currently working on with Birgit Mülliger in Austria. That's named the CLAR project, which addresses regional adaptation of climate change in 89 municipalities in Austria. Birgit is leading the project. Her email is here if anybody wants to contact her later for further information on the project. She focuses on 2 regions, Bad Ischl and Ebensee. And the nice thing is that the project started there already in 2022, which means the bot could actually discover outcomes, harvest outcomes. So we sent our link to 11 people altogether and got 7 responses, both from internal and external stakeholders. And most of the interviews of these 7 interviews took between 20 and 30 minutes. And in total, we got about 30 pages of transcript back from these interviews. Just imagine, you send off links, and then you get back 30 pages of interviews with summaries of outcomes. I thought that was quite a magic moment when I received these interviews. But what did the people say about these interviews? That's about user feedback now. And first of all summaries that we provided that the Qualia did were really correct. None of the respondents had any objections, and they all consented that they would be contacted, or that we could contact them as a research team. So apparently the bot didn't put them off completely. 5 already also reported really positive experience. Like if you look here, it works, it's good, it's all good, all is good. And one actually even said, thank you, it was really fun writing with you, which is quite nice. But then two of the people also said, well, there are some issues, and that involved that they felt that the interview was a bit artificial. And one, and that's particularly interesting to me, it felt repetitive. And I read the interview very careful with this person, and I didn't, as a harvester, I didn't find it repetitive at all. It's a normal harvesting interview where I need to dig deeper and make really clear who is the actor. But maybe from a human interviewer, it's more acceptable when I ask again for a specific fact. Maybe I can explain better while I'm doing this. So quickly to the results. You can, of course, analyze these 30 pages manually, as you do with outcome harvesting, or you stick it in one of the tools, the artificial intelligence tools that, for example, were presented in the February webinar of the outcome harvesting community by Hule and Leon. There's Outcome Harvester. We used the one from Leon Hemkemeyer, Outcome Harvester, and got 12 outcomes neatly written up in the format of outcomes. And don't read it yet, but just look at the colors. We got the who, we got the when the change was, we got the where the change was, and we got how, the blue, how the change occurred. The emergency organizations in Bad Ischl actually improved their collaboration on disaster preparedness. Now, well, as a human outcome harvester, I would have probably asked more details, like how exactly did they improve their collaboration? But maybe if I would have done it, the outcomes would also have been much longer, and therefore I would have gotten the information. It is amazing that with this little work, at least what we get is a very good start where we can prioritize outcomes and then see where we can follow up. So what's the learnings in the last few minutes? Let me talk a bit about what's our take-home messages from this little pilot study and the discussion points. So we really played a lot with the prompt. I think Gabi can confirm and Steve, but I think we had about 10 versions of the prompt, and with the current bot at least, the specific details were not as rich. But then, and we found that Qualia was perhaps too friendly. It stopped being nagging on details too early. But then from the user feedback, we also know that some people, at least two, got a little bit irritated by the interview being artificial or being repetitive. So when we use an artificial bot, maybe we need to strike a good balance, how extensively we want Qualia to follow up and keeping a relaxed and really nice atmosphere. So what's our takeaway? Qualia is really easy to use for the respondents, and even more so in the future with the speech option. It's really great to have these summaries reviewed, the outcome summaries right after the interview. And of course, it links well with any other tools, artificial intelligence tools that we may be using. So yes, it can save time and resources. And yes, it's great for scaling. My personal view is that I think it's a very good tool for generating so-called outcome leads, initial outcomes, then prioritize, as I said before, and follow up with those that are most promising or most worthwhile for this particular study. Now, last slide for my, or one before my last slide for discussion. I don't want to go into too much detail, but perhaps we can take up one or two of these points here. Reach inclusivity, for example. Yes, we can send the link to many people, but does this really mean that we can reach everybody? How widely is a bot really acceptable or accepted by people? And don't we exclude certain people who don't like bots, for example? How important is this human presence? At the EES, we heard that several talks actually that emphasized how important it is to establish trust and to consider not only the words, what a large language model does, but also consider the context. Then we have bias. Do you think that there's more or less bias in an interview when we use a bot? I mean, these opaque decision-making in artificial intelligence, does this worry you? And then finally, of course, data security and privacy. At least when we use GPT-4o, the data remains 30 days on OpenAI's servers. Of course, with Llama and other models, we have workarounds, but it's a question to consider, I believe. So thanks very much for your attention. We have here in the last slide a QR code and a link that you can use when you can download the presentation, or you make screenshots perhaps, that will bring up an interview. It's not an outcome harvesting interview, but it shows you how the bot is working and what type of questions it will pose you. You can do it several times, so you see that the bot varies. And if you have any further questions, please come back on us if you want to know how outcome harvesting works with Qualia. Get back to me. If you want to know more about Qualia, get back to Steve or to Gabi. Thanks very much. That's all for me now.
Thank you so much, Connie, for this interesting presentation on Qualia. Very interesting tool with a lot of potential. Also good that you raised some of the questions that we can definitely take up in the discussion. So thank you very much for that. I'm now going to put up the presentation of Heather Britt. So Heather, over to you to talk about principles.
Great, thanks. So this is kind of a two-part presentation. So Steve and I, and could you go back one slide, Willa? Yeah, okay, great. So Steve, I, and Gabi collaborated on a pilot looking at how to use AI-assisted causal mapping for outcome harvesting analysis. So Connie covered the data collection and we're covering the analysis. Yeah, so next slide, just to kind of give a, and the outcome harvesting process and kind of where this talk is located. Okay, next slide, please. So I'll talk about the analysis plan, using the importance of using a principle-led analysis plan to help make decisions about how you use AI in analysis. And then Steve's going to show some examples of the causal mapping maps and how we use those to answer some outcome harvesting questions. So, and Gabi was a very important part of this pilot. All right, so I'm a longtime outcome harvesting practitioner, and I've witnessed a lot of harvests that struggle to make sense of the outcome data to answer outcome harvesting questions, specifically around doing causal contribution and sense making around multiple outcomes. As a field, we kind of struggle with that. So I was lucky enough to meet Steve, and we began to talk about how to use causal mapping method and app in order to help with this this issue. And so we negotiated access to a data set of an evaluation that I had worked on. And that data set included both the interview transcripts and the outcome descriptions that had been crafted by the evaluation team. That is, they used the transcripts and then they crafted the outcome descriptions in the format. So we had both of those. And then we applied several AI-assisted analysis processes and compared them. So next slide, please. Okay, so there are several options to incorporating AI in analysis. And one question is whether or not to use the transcripts or the outcome descriptions. So we decided to use three main principles to help us make these decisions. And the first one was prioritizing local leadership and evaluation. The second one was preserving the integrity of the outcome harvesting method. And the third was producing accurate maps for actionable answers to answer the questions. Next slide, please. So a lot of us these days are putting special emphasis on prioritizing local leadership in our programs and evaluations. And reliance on specialized technology like AI and the expertise required to operate it has the potential to work against local leadership, right? So in our pilot, we explored ways to use AI while keeping the sense-making and learning in the hands of local evaluators and decision makers. Next slide, please. Thanks. So protecting the integrity of outcome harvesting method was another key principle. So as you all probably know, outcome harvesting has its own principles for guiding context-specific adaptation. And one that seemed particularly important to this pilot is less is more. This principle emphasizes learning, and basically the rule of thumb is don't collect more data that you don't have the time, resources, or capacity to analyze and use, right? Arguments in favor of AI tend to talk about being able to use larger and larger data sets. And I want us to think about size as being relative. So even a small time and resource constrained team may find it challenging to analyze a relatively small data set. And so an AI could assist there and be an important help. Okay, next slide, please. So the analysis plan, we made two key decisions, and the first in the analysis plan. And the first one was to segment the data by the outcome domain. So we used a single outcome domain. We isolated a single outcome domain for this pilot. The reasoning here is that analysis at the domain level has the potential to find coherent causal pathways and provide actionable findings to decision makers, because domains are often aligned with implementation strategies and project structures, right? The second choice was in the analysis plan was to map outcome descriptions rather than the transcripts. And this was the decision that kind of surprised us, because you might think, we did, that coding the transcript seems like less work on the front end for the evaluation team. But when we consider the principle of local leadership, we asked, where is the local leadership most important and most impactful? And for a lot of the projects that I work with, the involvement of the local evaluators is really essential in creating very rich outcome descriptions. And there's a lot of learning in there for them. So we made the decision to put the AI assist later in the process and review the transcripts that were human generated. The outcome descriptions that were human generated. And this also actually protected the integrity of the outcome harvesting method. I won't get into the details about where the errors popped up and how this, but there was a lot of refinements around that. Okay, so the takeaways from this is that our pilot demonstrated that causal mapping allows us to analyze the data sets of multiple outcomes to determine whether and how they contribute to domain level changes, and that causal mapping can help explore the interrelationships between individual causal pathways, and very exciting, look for evidence of how domain level outcomes influence additional and further changes. So this is really a step forward in some of the challenges we've been facing. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve now, and he's going to share some examples of how the maps generated help to answer specific outcome harvesting questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. Steve, over to you.
Can you hear me fine?
Yes.
Great. So sorry, is it Heather or Connie who's got the slide? Because I don't. Like, who's moving them on?
Can you see the slide, Steve?
I can see them, but I don't know how to move them on. Is it? I thought. Does Heather? Do you have? Can you move to the next slide? Right. Brilliant. Thank you. All right. So yes, hi. So I'm Steve Powell. I've been working at Causal Map for quite a few years now. And what we do is we use causal mapping to make sense of the world, especially for evaluators. Causal mapping is a well-established technique. It goes back to the 70s. Until very recently, it was done by hand. So you get a lot of documents like transcripts, interviews with respondents, for example, or other documents. And then you identify sections where somebody says that one thing causes or leads to or influences something else, and you highlight it. And then on the basis of that highlighted piece of text, you decide what's the cause and what's the effect, so to speak. And then when you've done all of that highlighting and identified all of those links from causes to effects, you can assemble all of the causes and the effects and try to get like a map of the whole thing. So it's been done by hand until very recently, but with AI, there are new possibilities to do like a lot more, a lot faster, which obviously changes the game quite a lot in terms of the kind of projects you can do causal mapping in, or the kind of data sets you can use to try to map. So in the case of outcome harvesting, it's sort of towards what we're looking at here is more at the end of the process. So it's more, you've already got your outcome descriptions, but how can you make sense of them, as Heather just said. So can we have the next slide? Thanks. So the outcome domain in this case for this pilot was increased community support for education. The project was training local teachers to facilitate community learning circles, and the whole point was to get children to keep engaged in learning activities during lockdown at home. And the change agents were local teachers. So the next slide, please. And this is an example of one of the domain level outcomes, one of the descriptions. There's 13 of them altogether. They're numbered, a little bit confusing. This is number 30, for example, but it's actually it's 13 of them altogether. And this is an example of what this outcome description looks like. Altogether 11 A4 pages. Next slide, please. So it's a moderate amount of text. You could probably have processed it by hand, but it's a good example, like a pilot, for what would you do if you had a lot more of this kind of material. So we wanted to see what were the main contributions to this domain level outcome. And here we've collapsed all of the different 13 outcomes into just community supports learning, which is the big box in the middle here. And we're looking on the left are all the things that contributed to it according to the stakeholders. So the number 2 in the middle there says that Project X designed the CLC intervention. 2 different descriptions, not really people, but different outcome descriptions mention this as being a factor that contributes to the outcome domain. And there's also some expected outcomes here on the right. Could you click again on the slide? There we go. So as well as the expected actors, there were also a couple of unexpected actors mentioned in one outcome domain each, head teachers and line ministry workers, which was something which is not incredibly surprising, but wasn't actually anticipated in the project. So because there's a few tips there in reading the maps, you can see that the light blue outline here, the sort of grey blue outline in the middle, is the one that we're focusing on, and we're looking at what contributes to that. So if you click again, please, we get to the next slide. There we go. So the important point here is that we're not doing what they call causal inference here. We're not saying at any point, oh, because somebody believed that X caused Y, that means we've proven that X causes Y. Not at all. It's just a way of assembling the evidence, and then the evaluator sits and looks at the evidence and says, weighing up everything that I've got and looking at this in context, I think this is or is not strong or weak evidence that these things were actually happening. So it's not an evaluation approach. It's just a tool for evaluators to use their contribution analysis, or whatever else they're using. So it's a tool to aid them doing that. Human judgment is required, and very importantly, we certainly don't give the AI or even just the causal mapping algorithms, these filters, the authority to make decisions for us. It's the humans, the evaluators, that do that. In this case, Heather. Would you click again, please? And it's very important that these are not just hand wavy sort of lines. These are each one of these lines. If it says 3 there, then it means there are 3 different quotes from 3 different outcome descriptions, which give you evidence for this link in context. So click again, please. Yeah, and in this case, you can see there's most evidence for the top one, where there's a 5 leading to the middle box. So we can't say this is a stronger link, but we can say there's most evidence for this link, which is an important distinction. Next, please. Right, so this is the second question we had, which is like super interesting for outcome harvesters, I think. So you have these 13 outcome descriptions, but you don't know how they're interconnected. They're sort of in words, they're obviously interconnected, but how exactly? So what we do here is we zoom out. We zoom in, we look at all the details inside the outcome domain, community supports learning, and there are 13 different outcome descriptions here. but the language of some of them are echoed in others, either in the actual title of other outcome descriptions or in the material in the body of the outcome description. Some of them are talking about the same thing, or they're talking about overlapping things. So here, these 13, you can see how these 13 different outcomes all contribute to one another according to the outcome descriptions. And we can see as well, I think if you could click again, I think we'll see something else opening up. Yes, so we can see here that the one in the middle, this outcome description 44, was identified in 5 different descriptions, where something of the same sort was mentioned in 4 other different outcome descriptions. And you can also see it's quite central in the layout. That's important. So it's playing perhaps a central role, parents actively supporting home learning in the whole sort of causal network or set of mechanisms which are helping to make this project work. And you can spend a lot of time looking at this diagram and saying, oh, that's interesting, that's mentioned here. Number 42, leaders convince, is also important, but more on the left there, but more as a driver perhaps than driving the other outcomes. So you can spend a lot of time looking at that and trying to understand how the different outcomes are fitting together. On the next slide, please. So this is the third question. How do outcomes contribute to broader changes? Now, sometimes there's a lot of maybe expected, unexpected changes further downstream from the kind of intended outcome domain. In this case, there's only a couple. If you could click, please. There you go. These 2 at the end, where children improve their study skills and also children actually learn better. And this is mentioned a few times, kind of a little bit in passing while the outcomes are being discussed. Other times you'd have more, in other projects, you'd probably find more evidence further downstream of longer term or more distal impacts of the project. So next slide, please. So takeaways from this. Causal mapping, well, because causal mapping has been used in evaluation for 50 years by hand. It already has been contributing to helping to answer questions, also in outcome harvesting, about how different outcomes are connected to one another and what are the inputs to them and how are they affected, how do they affect the outcomes, and also downstream of the outcomes, what else happens. And we've done it with AI, and it seems to work very nicely with AI, and it has the ability to process larger amounts of data. But it's important to use principles to guide the decisions about where and how to use the AI. And as we've said here, this isn't a sort of free pass to saying, oh, I now know what causes what. We have to sit down, just as we always did as human evaluators, and say, this seems to me like sufficient evidence to make this causal claim, or plausibly, or not at all, depending on what we consider. So I think that's it. Yes, who's going to talk over this one? Should I?
Yes, go ahead, Steve.
Right. So there's also, we're all of us part of, well, some of us are part of an initiative, the Causal Pathways Resource Hub, which is, or Causal Pathways, which is an initiative which is somewhat centered around US philanthropy, but also goes around the rest of the world. It's a bunch of experts, and we have a brains trust, we have a set of resources, we have a set of case studies, and it's all kind of around the idea of, let's say, qualitative understanding of causality, which is a bit more than what a statistician might understand, and is more about understanding pathways and how things are linked together. And it kind of joins together a lot of different methods and overlaps with a lot of other methods and tools and approaches. And there is now a resource hub at the well-known Better Evaluation website, which is all about causal pathways, and it's pretty cool. So if you want to scan that QR code, you can enjoy looking around on that site. So I think that's it from me, at least.
Great. Thanks a lot, Steve. And thank you to all presenters for these very interesting presentations that show the potential that artificial intelligence has for outcome harvesting, but at the same time also raising some questions, some cautions when doing so. So let's look at your questions now. I'm going to pull them up, but while I do so, please do feel free to also raise your hand, and then you can also open your mic and ask your questions. So we also love hearing from you directly. I have a question here, and this is to Connie from Dina. So do you use the language of game changer? What is the actual question, and I guess it's a bit two things. What's the actual question for identifying change? And can the question be changed depending on the target groups? So basically, the first one is, do you use the language of game changer?
Yeah, first question, no, absolutely not. That was, since we know we're talking to evaluators, smell-prone people, I wanted to quickly get across that we first want to come to an important change for this pilot. Of course, you can change it and adapt this bot to whatever project you're working on. But what the bot actually asked was for internal stakeholders, for example, because of course you can't give him a proper question, the bot will come up with a question, but it would ask, for example, to an internal one, what has changed with respect to adapting to climate change? Or have you seen an important change in the municipality since project started? Because the internal would know when the project started. The external, it would ask, for example, what has changed with respect to climate change over the last 3 years? Yeah, so it would adapt it and it would not use the word game changer, which wouldn't be understood. The second part of the question, Julia, remind me.
What is the actual question for identifying change, and can a question be changed depending on the target groups?
That I think I answered.
You answered that, yeah.
Well, you can change it. You could tell the bot exactly what to ask, but then you could do a survey. So we want the bot really to really understand the nuances of the respondent and find the question that works and continue until he has actually identified an outcome, whether it's a behavior change or not, and then continue and find out who exactly changed, as we would do as harvesters.
Great. Okay. And another question from Dina as well is, shouldn't confidentiality come first?
Yes, in fact, we had a pop-up. Actually, our bot has a pop-up when you start, and there you can put information that's important for you. For example, it'll take 10 to 15 minutes or 20 to 30 minutes. And also in the beginning, we had a statement that please don't provide any very confidential information. Then we considered for this pilot, it might be better to first, because it's all open. There's no issues with confidentiality in this project. So we thought maybe that makes people more hesitant. We wanted to test the bot and not the actual content of the interview. So we had the interview first and then raised the question, if there was anything, please make sure that we don't mention it. It will stay with the research team, but we wouldn't share it with other people. But you're right, you can do it whenever and wherever, in the beginning or at the end.
Great, okay. And then Barbara Klugman is asking, would it be right to assume that using the bot assumes people are very literate and comfortable with computers, even though they can answer verbally rather than in writing?
Yeah, now we're getting to the really important parts. Are we inclusive or are we not inclusive? Well, for one thing, I should say, technically, people can use the bot on their mobile. They still need to read at the present, but there will be a stage, I guess, where the bot can actually talk to you, and then you just need to talk back with a device that is somehow can use a browser. So your mobile, you can do this on your mobile and you can push a button and then talk back. But of course, I think what's even more important to me currently is it's not only that they really need to be very literate. And yes, I agree. Of course, they do have kind of an understanding of what's being asked, and they need to read at the current stage. But some people really hesitate talking to a bot. They want a human. And others, but there are also others that feel freer when they don't have a human, but feel they are more comfortable, actually, like the digital natives now. Some kids are so comfortable in telling everything on TikTok and on whatever. So they might actually trusting an AI more, which is an issue in itself. Yeah. So that's something we need to explore. Do we include a certain type of audience more than others? And again, it depends on the study you're doing, but you need to be aware of these biases. Maybe so far for now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Could I add to that?
Yes, sure, Steve.
Like, I mean, the whole thing of like who responds to, as a psychologist, who responds to an interview in which situation, when, and how. It's really interesting. I mean, there are studies from the 70s, which we look back on and laugh now, where there's a kind of like a pretend interview bot, like on a typewriter, which or a computer terminal, which kind of made ridiculously trivial kind of conversation. But it was the studies even then showed that it was amazing how people opened up to something that was kind of ELIZA, like a therapist. You can look it up. People open up to in a sort of giving like clinically relevant information to something that's just like a really stupid little computer loop, I think probably on balance, most of the research says that people will be more candid in talking to a machine than to a human. And probably in a way that is good for validity. It doesn't mean that they always tell the truth and they don't to humans by any means, but on balance, I think probably, let's say, give as valid answers at least. But I mean, that's not true for everybody, and it skews it. Like some people will certainly not be comfortable at all, whereas other people would. And so just one more thing. The other thing is not just that part, but the whole audio or typing part. And we quite like the typing part because at the moment the answers are just by typing because people are used to like text and WhatsApp and these things. Whereas the voice part, we've tried it where the respondent speaks, raises a whole lot of other issues about like how one should speak and when one should stop and how long one should speak for, etc. Yeah, Connie?
Not sure whether I can take up more time. Juli, should we have another question or should I briefly jump in?
Yeah, you can jump in and then we'll move to the next question.
Just briefly re-emphasizing, I don't see the bot as a replacement for the human, but it's a screening of like including more voices, then screening where there are actually changes and then prioritizing and summing up. And then we as human interviewers, currently at least, can go back to these people and we will still try to talk to them to really fully understand, also to understand more about the context. So that's how I personally, for myself, currently see the huge advantage of a bot, but that doesn't answer the question of inclusiveness. We will always exclude a certain type of person, I guess.
Great. Okay. Well, that's a very interesting point. Also, the fact that you would think that people are maybe less comfortable with a bot, but also pointing out that some people are more comfortable, I think is also an interesting one. Okay, a question about the transcript. Does the tool also analyze the transcripts and provide broader summary or key highlights from all transcripts? And how accurate are these transcripts?
Yeah, maybe I make a start and then Gavi and Steve jump in again. It was actually my fault. I shouldn't probably call it transcripts because in effect, as long as we do it in a written way, it's not transcripts. What the people type in is really what they type in. So they have reviewed and seen it. And the bot also comes up with the question. It's not a transcript from audio. So that's the difference. Maybe we need to find another term there, Steve.
Well, yeah, I mean, interview transcripts, I don't know. Yeah, that's what we call it. But yes, it could be a bit confusing. I mean, it's not the thing about the voice-driven interview. I mean, you can have the AI interviewer can have actual audio, or the respondent can actually speak into a microphone, or both. And then, but the question is then how that works. And there are some other similar tools where it's audio to audio, but you still got to watch your screen. You still got to press like go and stop and stuff. So it's a lot more obvious how to do a chat-based AI interview than it is how to do an audio interview. There's different expectations around it, and probably this will change in the next 12 months. I'd have thought there'll be more of these tools and there'll be more of a kind of default or expectation what to expect. And now I think if you clicked on a link that said you're going to be interviewed by an AI interview, you wouldn't know what to expect. So, but at the moment, the audio that when we're using audio, the transcript, so to speak, is very good. But that crosses over into the question of language, because at the moment the tool will recognize what language you use in your browser. If you're normally speaking Portuguese or something, then it will start. The UI will be, the buttons will be in Portuguese, and it will start talking to you, chatting to you in Portuguese, and you can then answer in Portuguese. But if you then say, "Oh, actually, I'd rather speak German," then it will also happily switch to German. So it's multi-language from that point of view, which I think is a little bit of an answer to the previous question as well about inclusivity. So although it's not all world languages, but it'll certainly do Swahili and that kind of thing. And so it certainly spreads the reach, especially if you've got a multi-country project or a project that involves stakeholders with different languages.
Yeah, great indeed. That supports inclusiveness. There was a question to you, Heather, about how you define the outcome domains. I think you answered it in the chat, but just for those who haven't seen it, could you just repeat that?
Sure. So there's kind of one, you can think about it when planning for data collection. And then I think what we were trying to do is talk about it from analysis. So because outcome harvesting is a complexity aware approach and it's trying to collect outcomes regardless of whether or not they were predicted in advance or not. And so it's kind of a broad area of changes, and it tells your harvester where to look without being overly specific. So that's when you're talking about it from the data collection side. And then what we were trying to do was say, well, what are within an outcome domain, and ours was community support for education, right? So there were a variety of different activities that the project was doing in order to influence and strengthen community support for education. And there was a number of outcomes. I think we something like 13 or 14 for this particular data set that were within that. And so what we were trying to do was look to see whether or not there's any causal relationships between those 14, 13 separate outcomes, and to answer that question. Are they the same exact outcome, but in different regions? How are they or are they actually interrelated with each other in a causal way? And that's what the causal mapping approach did. And then we used AI as Steve was to make that easier to do. I hope that explains.
Yes, it does explain, because Barbara is saying thank you. She uses a different word for that, but yeah, it's good. Okay, then a question to Steve. Martina Bellotti is asking, what are the criteria to identify whether outcomes are interrelated?
Right. Well, that's what the causal mapping does, and it's not magic, and it's not essentially an AI thing. It's I mean, the easy question is just, there's two answers, an easy one and a hard one. The easy one is just when you do causal mapping, you simply highlight claims. If somebody says, oh, I think the improvement in this was mainly because of meeting the colleagues from the other side, or whatever they said, you highlight that and you say, meeting the colleagues from the other side, improvement in these services, whatever. So inside the outcome descriptions, this is quite subtle. So this isn't the original interviews. This is already prepared outcome descriptions, which Heather's team had already, in a participatory way, developed and taken ownership of. So they're already an intermediate, almost a final product, really. The question is to look back again at this text. So it's a bit different from when you're looking at transcripts, which you can also try to do. And in this case, it's a bit more subtle because the outcomes themselves, on the one hand, they overlap sometimes, quite a lot, they overlap a bit in their meaning, so there are verified, if you like, outcomes, but they nevertheless talk about something similar, maybe in a different village or a different school or a different context. But also it's possible that, so there's an overlapping in meaning, but there's also simply causal connections, that maybe one outcome is established outcome, but it also contributes to a different outcome that you've also already established. So the ways in which the links are drawn is a question of how you do causal mapping, and the key is finding common statements. So if maybe common labels, if you like. So if in one statement it says, outcome description, it says, so the children started to read more, and in a different outcome description it mentions somewhere because the children were studying more, you have to decide, well, is that the same thing? Can I call them the same thing and then join them together and put that into my causal map? Or do I have to say, no, it's not the same thing because I'm very interested in the difference between reading and something else. So these are also, in the end, human-led decisions about how to aggregate the information from the different texts. In this case, it's quite difficult to understand because it's not transcripts. That'd be quite easy to understand, but there are already outcome descriptions that have been assembled by a team in a participatory manner led by an outcome harvesting expert. So, and the point is to help the outcome harvesting expert to then better understand how these different outcomes fit together or influence one another.
Great.
We're going,
Yes.
we're going to be having, sorry, Heather, just before, we're going to have a case study on this that Heather and the two of us are writing. So Gabriella and I.
Okay, Heather.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Steve's good explanation. It's kind of a multi-layered, our pilot tried to address several different issues. One of them was just how do you do causal contribution analysis when you're trying to look at multiple outcomes and make sense of whether or not they're related to one another. And causal mapping seemed like a really good approach to do that. And then we asked ourselves, well, and let's use AI in that to make it easier. So that was another layer. And then, well, if we're going to do this, at what point are we going to introduce this into the outcome harvesting process? Well, let's use principles in order to help us make some of those decisions. So there's a number of different kind of layers in the pilot.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Heather. And then maybe one last question. Connie, you mentioned about bias. I thought that was also an interesting question. Let's see from all of you if you have some thoughts about that. So is there more or less bias with AI than with humans?
Are you asking me now, or
You
are
can
you
all
putting up
all
the-
respond to that if you have thoughts on that. What's your experience?
I'd love to hear the audience, to give room to the audience. If they don't, I definitely, we can discuss this again, but I'd love to hear if people have thoughts here.
I would suggest go ahead. And meanwhile, if you have some input on this, please do raise your hand.
Could I maybe, while we're waiting for folks I could just sort of explain some of the error issues that we ran into and some of the, I don't have an overall generic answer for is it more biased, but when we, for instance, started running it on transcripts, we quickly discovered some errors popping up because people don't talk with, they talk about a project in a different way than an evaluator or an implementer might, and not in set categories. They might talk about their experience with the project holistically and not always stick within like a specific domain. So we said, we're going to just look at this category of changes. And they're just talking about everything they know and experience about the project. So we kept having to sort out things. That ended up meaning that we had to get so involved into the process. And then we realized we're kind of taking it in a different direction. And so with these choices that we kept making about, and those require an in-depth knowledge of the project. And so someone who doesn't know about the project couldn't be making those decisions, and AI can't make those decisions. So it was we had these very interesting discussions, the three of us, about who should be doing what tasks and why. And so I don't know if that answers bias with a big B, but it does give a little bit about our journey around trying to find accuracy.
Yes, great. Thanks, Heather. Steve, I see you had some input on that.
Actually, it's a different Steve, I think. You typed something.
Oh, okay. Sorry. More than one Steve here. Okay. Okay, the other Steve in the audience. Would you like to tell us what you said here?
My experience, the trap I fall into sometimes in interview processes and harvesting outcomes is that I focus in on sometimes the most articulate or the clearest example, or maybe the first example of the day. And what I find with AI is it tends to smooth that process out and represent everybody more equally. So I find it one of the best parts of using AI, actually.
Okay, great. That's good to hear. So there might be less bias if you use AI. Yeah, and there's probably a lot of things that can be said about that. Very interesting discussions, but we're coming towards the end of our webinar here. But definitely to be continued. So I really want to thank all our presenters here today for all those insights and thoughts. I think there's a lot to think about or to further experiment with. So thank you very much. Thank you also for the audience for joining us today. Just a few practical things before we leave here. So we will have 2 more webinars of presentations that were held at the EES conference coming up in November and December. They will be announced on the Outcome Harvesting Community forum as well as the website. So do keep an eye out for that. We are experiencing a few problems with the groups, which is what we're using for the email list of the forum of Outcome Harvesting. So it may be that you're not always receiving all messages. We're working on that, but just so you know that we're trying to solve that. So once again, thank you very much for joining us today, and see you at the next webinar. Bye bye, everyone.